Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Hello, I'm Colonie Town Judge Peter Crummey, and welcome to Benchmark. We'll explore a variety of issues involving our legal system, our justice system, and how they intersect with the citizens of the town of Colonie. Today, we are truly fortunate to have as our guest Keith Hirokawa. Keith Hirokawa is a professor of law at Albany Law School, teaching courses not only in land use planning, but also in property law and environmental law. Today, we have Professor Hirokawa here to talk to us about a book he has co-authored, just published this year, Greening Local Government: Legal Strategies for Promoting Sustainability, Efficiency, and Fiscal Savings. And thank you very much, Professor, for being with us today.
Thank you, Judge, for having me. It's very exciting to be here.
This book is fabulous, and I've heard from so many people who have had the opportunity to read it together with me that it's actually an excellent work. In fact, probably one of the premier works right now on greening local government. And we're so lucky to pull you away, not only from book tour, but also in connection with teaching at Albany Law School, to talk to us a few minutes about this very important subject. The foreword itself points out some very key issues for all of us to consider as we move forward in developing our local governments. In fact, we find that there are as many as 40,000 local governments in the United States of America. And recognizing that, therefore, they are probably collectively and in the aggregate represent one of the largest employers in our entire nation. Considering that figure, and considering that by mid-century, it's projected that there will be an additional 100 million residents in the United States alone, this book couldn't come out at a better time. And there's a variety of issues that you've touched in here as almost a manual, and to give local governments opportunities to think of a variety of different ways in which they could address some of these issues to make a greener nation for all of us, which is not only good for us, but for the entire world as well. And you've done a fabulous in-depth study, providing opportunities for governments to consider a variety of different issues that you've already considered and laid out for all of us. It's a manual that all local governments should be considering in that way. Tell us about what some of the topics that you've discussed here in greening local government.
Sure, Judge. As you said, this book comes out at a time where we seem to be at the cusp of more growth, with some uncertainty as to what the future holds, and with approximately 40,000 governmental entities and all of the people that we do anticipate coming down the pipe. We can ask simple questions to get us to some searching answers, such as, where are these people going to live, right? How far will they drive to get to school and work? And do we have the infrastructure that's capable of facilitating that? So the topics in this book are supposed to ask the questions and present some model answers, some examples of local governments that are doing some really innovative practices, both in the way they structure governmental operations, including how the public participates to identify values of the community and how to implement them. But also, besides governmental operations, also how we design communities. Designing communities so that people don't have to drive so far, so that we don't have to build hundreds and thousands of miles of new road and stretches of laying pipe for water and sewer. We try to say, for instance, keep close to built infrastructure, maybe increased densities, different kinds of innovative topics of planning that allow us to project less of a cost of growth well into the future. Right? So how do we design communities so that they're, in a word, sustainable?
Well, and back then you consider the three pillars that you've recognized in your study, in-depth study in your book, Greening Local Government, and you point out that decisions should be made by local governments considering economic, environmental, and social issues, and how, and those are the key elements. And what do you mean by that? What are the ideas there?
Right. So maybe this is controversial, to be honest with you, because it's hard to think about how all three of our pillars of sustainability, economic, environmental, and social equity, can be met in every decision. And I think one of the groundbreaking ideas of sustainability is that we get out of a way of thinking that economics means it's not also environmental, right? So when we start talking about this sustainable decision making, we can think about why it is that certain kinds of environmental protections give us an enormous economic advantage, or how to perform economic growth in ways that don't isolate particular communities or discredence or minorities, or how to make sure that economic development is also doing a good job at integrating with the environment. So these are the sustainable decisions allow us to think in all three pillars, maybe sort of three dimensions, but simultaneously to make sure that the best decision is the one that capitalizes on all three and in fact satisfies all three needs.
Well, there's so many ideas that have been put forth in this book, and as simple as municipalities consider how they want to develop their community as it moves forward, something as simple as, well, we should consider transit and how people could access those places or that development with the least amount of effort or damage to our environment as they move. Will this development require only the access is only by automobile? Or could we consider how we're going to use this development to allow multimodal opportunities to be able to access this area, including walking, running, and biking, and mass transit as well? It's just a simple way to recognize what should be considered as we move forward in development. Are there other things too that you can readily think of that are also items that should be considered by local governments and how they plan for the future?
Right. Well, one of the topics, my topic in the book, is about urban forests. And this, I think, is another simple idea, kind of like the transit-oriented development idea. I mean, with transportation, what we needed to do was break out of the old model of saying further away from the city is where the good life is. Right. And then maybe it is for some people, but it's so expensive to let more development happen that far out. So it was a simple idea, as you mentioned, Judge, to say, let's figure out how to have the good life and allow for development in ways that aren't overly taxing on the way we design our communities and the way we operate government. So urban forest has this element too, because we've all sort of grown up with greenery. And I think one of the one of the innovative ideas is to recognize these days what urban ecologies do, the advantages that we get. And this is the realm that we refer to these days as ecosystem services. And this concept recognizes that on the one hand, ecosystems produce goods. We get bananas, we get crops, wildlife, and some such things that we can take from the environment and they have a market value. They're goods. Ecosystem services is the idea that in addition to the goods, that ecosystems work, right? That there are processes that we benefit from. So trees capture carbon in the air. They capture pollutants in stormwater. In fact, they capture stormwater itself. They give us shade, so we may not have to turn on the air conditioning in the summer. They create habitats. a lot of these services that trees give us, particularly in the urban area, are very valuable. But we haven't figured out a way, or at least up till recently, how to calculate that benefit and how to figure out whether it's a public benefit. Right. So now what we're realizing is with a more robust urban forest, we may be saving millions in terms of avoiding the cost of constructing a facility to clean the water, because trees do that,
right.
Or to control the amount of stormwater so that we prevent flooding. Trees do this too. Local governments all over the place, but it's growing, are assessing by way of inventory of their urban forest as an asset, and calculating that benefit that they can calculate in terms of dollars and cents. Some of the examples are, really breathtaking. So Roanoke, Virginia is one that comes up because they did a fairly simple analysis. They just wanted to know, what do trees do? And what they figured was a very good correlation between trees in the urban area and property values, so people like that. Then they realized that with the number of trees in the location, that new development wouldn't be required to, say, build very expensive stormwater control facilities, and at the price tag, which is almost sort of embarrassing to say, but into the many millions of dollars. So what they were doing was realizing the avoidance of the cost of building these facilities and realizing that as a benefit to the community. The conclusion in Roanoke, which it won't always be the case, but certainly will be in many places, is if they get that much benefit out of the urban forest that they do have, maybe they'll get more benefit by expanding the forest in the urban area. So these are, simple ideas, that the existence of trees in our neighborhood is something that it's not unfamiliar to us, but it's recognizing the benefit that is the kind of innovative way of thinking that we might turn to now.
Professor, do you think that in some urban development years ago, that the way it was developed rendered the notion of urban forest an oxymoron? That they didn't have any, but we should have more? Or, some cities did develop certain areas, parks and things like that, in order to provide not only opportunities, I suppose, for recreation, what's their primary concern probably,
right.
But the benefits that it has overall is obviously recognized even by you in your book, Greening Local Government. But do you think that there were some developments at some point that were just bare of any type of recognition about how trees could do so much for the environment?
Okay, so there were certainly times when trees were in the way.
Right. Yeah.
And I think, certainly today, it may be the case that trees sort of are in the way from time to time. I'm not sure that's the most, say, far-reaching way or insightful way to look at it. But I think what you're pointing out is how common it is to, say, drive past a new development site right after it's been cleared of everything.
Right.
Right. So where we start is maybe even a place that kids used to play in the woods or something with tree stands, and it's not there anymore. Instead of what we see is a bunch of dirt that's been pushed around and no more vegetation at all to prepare to lay foundations for new homes and some such things. So, yes, I think it's a little bit cultural, it's a little bit contextual and regional, perhaps, right. And maybe a lot of property owners, when they're developing, in particular, don't see the trees as assets. Right, because maybe a property owner doesn't say, all the carbon that's being captured in this tree is turning into dollars and cents for me, since I can build one fewer house or not as big of a building as I'd like because the tree's in the way. So this is why these kinds of policies, if local governments and communities want to capitalize on their assets, their natural assets, that it has to happen at the governmental level. Because it may not happen at the property level, where particular property owners may not realize that benefit as directly.
That's right. Yeah. And how in an aggregate form, it's better for all of us.
I think that might be right.
And one of the topics that you touched on in the book, of course, is and referring to New Orleans. And of course, as we all recognize, they suffered a great loss after the Hurricane Katrina. But as a result, it provided them a footprint to actually start over and to take some of the ideas that you write about here in this book, too, about how to move forward. I'd like to hear more about how New Orleans is moving forward and adopting greening of their local government.
Right. So New Orleans, of course, is a difficult case because it's very emotional, and some things went pretty wrong there. But we've learned some pretty good lessons out of post-Katrina New Orleans, and they fall into two categories. And one is what we generally refer to as preparedness. So the idea of preparation for climate change is really talking about the kinds of ways our city is designed to withstand some of the uncertainties, like major storm events that we may not have had to weather before. So preparedness requires us to go beyond sort of simple emergency planning, but to design the city to be a little more resilient, to be climate ready. So that was important to learn, and it's incredibly unfortunate we learned the hard way. What New Orleans is doing now, I think, they're learning still, but they're involving the public in a major public participation effort to design the city in ways that allow them to integrate the democratic ideas of public participation, the way that they can capture community values in that process, but also integrate the ideas of making the city and the residents of the city less of consumers of energy, right, and water, so that they're using less, so that they're less reliant on infrastructure. They're creating more and more linked green spaces that allow for more green infrastructure, more of the ecosystem services that we talked about. So some of the things that are happening there are very innovative. It's not a clean slate, but it is another chance to build in some of these innovative, climate-ready, smart growth ideas, both into the way the government operates and the way that the community operates through design.
And many of the ideas, actually, that are put forth and recognized in your book actually save money and resources, and at the same time provide for a greener lifestyle. Are there any negatives that you see as we move forward? And why would somebody say, gee, I don't want to do any of these things? I mean, why wouldn't they want to consider?
Well, that sounds pretty humbuggish to me.
Right.
Well, this is a great question. So why would somebody refuse to make a decision that's an economic benefit over a long period of time, that preserves the natural capital, the benefit of the environment, and that doesn't disfavor anybody in ways that are, say, we might consider unjust? So this is a difficult question, I think, primarily because, especially in election years and some such things, words like sustainability and green mean something other than the way that we're using them here. Green, say, for instance, may look agenda-oriented and not economic and environmental and social. So why would somebody refuse to implement these things? They're new. I mean, a lot of what's happening in the governments that are experimenting and innovating, some of them are failures. I mean, it has to happen that if we're reaching very high, that sometimes we won't be able to reach.
That's true.
But on the other hand, the successes are astounding. And so there have to be ways to build off the models that we're seeing, to capitalize on the examples. And there's going to be a lot of following some of these really exemplary instances where local governments are getting green. But in the meantime, we need to keep pushing and being as innovative as possible. We need to make sure that the public pressure to do this is kept as high as possible. That is to say, public participation is the key here, because without it, we fall into things like humbug, I don't need to be green. But probably the most important thing to think about is the reason to do it. Right. So what we're talking about in this book is governance. Right. It's just how it is that through government, through collaborating in a community, we can minimize risks to the people that live there. So if we talk about green governance or sustainable governance, we're talking about minimizing risks in ways that cover our three pillars, that are economically advantageous, that capitalize on our natural capital, our green capital assets, and of course that have social equity components as well. So minimizing risks in this way. It's a difficult vocabulary. We're talking about ways of thinking that maybe we're not familiar with. But like I said, it's important to keep the public participation up and keep thinking about this stuff.
Well, I enjoy the way you've presented it, too, in the book, because you're not being alarmist. You're just saying these are things, let's look at the facts. We have 100 million more people coming into our nation in the less than 40 years from now. And where will they live? How will they live? What kind of housing will it be? What will the house be made of? What are we doing? Where are we getting all of the particular resources to provide that? And how they come and go to their residence and where they work and where will they be working in 40 years? And how can we structure that to make our communities continue to grow and to provide opportunities here in New York, for instance, for our children to stay here and not have to go elsewhere to find employment or to find adequate housing for them and their own families. It's an opportunity for all governments here. And especially in upstate New York, to realize that these are opportunities that we can make for our descendants as well. It's a very important thing to consider in how we should develop now, and those of us in local government now should be holding on to these ideas and moving forward. It's really presenting a brave new world. I really appreciate that you've come out and co-authored such a book for all of us in that way. I noticed that oftentimes courts can certainly get involved in development issues. I served as the Town of Colonie Zoning Board attorney for 13 years, presiding over no less than 1,500 applications for variances during that 13-year period, and all of those single decisions had an aggregate impact as well, whether it was yes, no, or modified. Nonetheless, it had an impact on how the town continued to move in its way. And I know you have some sections on zoning law, and of course that's often applied by the zoning board or reacted to by the zoning board in many municipalities, but also in connection with that, how courts can also get involved in shaping that, and many times decisions of local governments on development are challenged and do come to the court. I know our own Supreme Court weighed in on environmental issues itself in a celebrated case, Massachusetts versus the EPA, not that long ago, and cited the international impact of how our environment may be changing, and with warming issues, et cetera, and how mankind's impact and development itself could have on how our ecosphere can change too. And now our Supreme Court is addressing some of those issues or referring to them in decisions. How do you see courts having an impact, and have they had any yet?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's unfortunately an uncertain answer.
Right.
So, in large part, but not exclusively, the courts have been used to, and maybe perhaps as they always are, but to weather or slow down regulatory change. Right. So, in areas where we're experimenting with new types of regulations, where it looks like maybe this isn't the way we treated property in the past, the courts have been called upon to make sure that such changes occur within the confines of due process and some such things. And often what that means is the courts don't allow us to be too innovative. And I think we had sort of joked before about where this all began, and it's worth remembering that the first major zoning decision in the Supreme Court, which is the Euclid decision in 1926, Justice Sutherland was faced with the idea of zoning, brand new, almost new at the time, a couple decades old at that time. And Justice Sutherland pointed out that the advent of the automobile was changing everything. And people didn't have to live within 2 blocks of work. They could live very far from work. And because of technology, because the elevator, which I think had only really been invented a couple decades before as well, civil society looked different, right? And with all these new forms and practices and some such things, were different kinds of impacts. And I think Justice Sutherland sort of decided to step out of the way a little bit and say, local governments need the power to address these things, or we just don't know, they may be uncontrollable. So zoning was approved because local governments needed rational ways to slow down technological changes, to control the impacts, to be able to maintain a quality of life, notwithstanding the fact that now everybody's driving, and they weren't before.
Right.
So, you know, litigation has this effect occasionally of asking local governments, state, federal governments, asking governments to stay within the confines of things that we know. And what local governments are doing right now are pushing some of those ideas into, with using sort of old wineskins, but producing new wines, new flavors of how it is that property relates to ecosystem services, of uncertainty of weather events, and how to manage things like moving coastlines from rising seas. How do we deal with questions like this? And I think the courts, you know, from Euclid have said our governments need a little bit of leeway to figure this out, and our litigation will try to keep that in check. The reason, or one way of looking at the Euclid decision and Justice Sutherland, and this is 1926, but one way of looking at it is the reason that the court allowed local governments so much leeway was because it was premised on the idea of nuisance. And I think this is special and important because what we get out of the law of nuisance, the way that we figure out if there's been a nuisance and if it's actionable, if the state should intervene, is by looking at the context, by looking at the community, by trying to figure out today what are the values that are important, and does this activity or the impacts of this activity offend that? Nuisance was helpful there and will probably continue to be helpful because everything continues to change. The technologies, right, the environment, the way our social practices direct us to drive or use mass transit or ride our bikes, or even what transit looks like. So as these things continue to change, doctrines like nuisance allow the court to take stock and take an inventory of that particular day and try to project a little bit into the future as well. And I think Sutherland relied on that idea so he could say, tools like zoning allow us to react to protect the public welfare.
In connection with that and the whole notion underneath the book that you've co-authored, Greening Local Government, who do you think would benefit by reading this book? Who do you think would benefit?
I'd like to say everybody, Your Honor.
Well,
I mean, and for different reasons.
Right.
So our approach in putting the book together was that what we were talking about is governance, and particularly governance at the local level. And at least from my perspective, local government is the place where it's most accessible to the democratic process, right? So we engage in local governments to self-govern, to make decisions for ourselves. Now, that being the case, I think that anybody that is concerned about where they live should participate in how decisions about where they live are made, What this book provides for that perspective are some of the areas that we can push our governments, right? Some of the things that we can ask our governments to make better decisions, to make ones that over the long term will be less costly, that we won't have to spend so much money to recover from. Officials may get something out of this book because we're trying to provide examples of significant successes where some of these simple ideas, especially where they're implemented in simple ways, have been able to produce very tangible results, where they're not offensive to the public, where everybody can get on board and everybody seems to win. Attorneys hopefully will get something out of this book too, because there's a legal framework. And the legal framework, say, involves the Fifth Amendment and the protection of property, the right of due process, and changes to law and the way that we deal with the environment, which often is already owned by someone. There's a system of law that governs our rights and responsibilities, both as the public and as private owners, with respect to how those rights are allocated. So I think everybody.
Well, and you touched on something that early on in your discussion about who would benefit by the book, and I don't disagree with him. And you touched on the fact, which is the premise of the entire book, that the local government is really the basis of democracy. And it reminded me of Alexis de Tocqueville, who came here from France in 1830 and did quite a book on our American democrat system, and noted that the local government and even the local justice of the peace was where government really was seen and the democracy was really seen at that level. And then quantifying it the way you have and recognizing that there's 40,000 such governments in the United States of America, and the power that represents in aggregate certainly is the right place to be. And you brought this forth targeting one of the largest single employers in an aggregate in the entire country, and the impact that it can have if everybody at the local level just takes this as a roadmap to consider as they move forward in lifestyle and managing citizens, and all of us managing each other, and what that would take, rather than going after the federal government. Our government's changed quite a lot since our framers first decided what it should be, and democracy was designed to flow from the locals up to the top. And of course, as we know, that's quite changed in the United States of America, and now the power flows from the top down to the bottom for a variety of different reasons. So, but nonetheless, targeting the local governments is exactly a very beneficial effect.
And I think, Your Honor, I think you touched on it really well too. What's not being argued in this book is that it's an either-or, right? So this isn't whether local government is better than federal government at doing this.
That's right.
But rather, this is just pointing out, as you did, 40,000 local governments means an awful lot of decisions are being made. And it's an awful lot of access to the democratic process in the meantime. And so what this book is about is just recognizing, one, that there are a lot of opportunities here to improve the way we make decisions. But there's also something special, I think, that happens at local governments. And I think it's worth noting that we are situated in our homes in an environment, right? And communities and local governments are subject to this. That is to say, the environment I live in is not the one that somebody who lives in, say, Arizona has, or New York City. And it's important to note this because not that it's better than federal regulation, but it's different than federal regulation because it matters to a local government, say, if all of our soils are being washed away, or if the trees all fall, or if they're cut. Because this is our home, right? Maybe in an agricultural community, too much erosion and stormwater keeps us from planting, right? So our local environment, the way that we're situated in a particular place, means that local governments should be engaging in this all the time. and also that they do. Right? Local governments engage in their local environments because they are where they are. Right? They are governing in a situated way. They are governing there and not in Arizona or New York City. So the kinds of ideas that we're talking about, of say, thinking about the ways that our natural capital, our natural environment are economically advantageous, that they are social issues, that of course they're environmental issues, largely relates to the fact that local governments are where they are, that they have to take that into account.
You know, I from time to time over the years, we're all exposed to the political polls, and the question is, do you think a particular candidate or a government is going on the right track or the wrong track? Do you see any? Do you see government, any examples of government on the wrong track? I know you propose a lot of ideas that they should be considering as we move forward, but are there any examples contained in the book that suggest that this is a wrong track and we should avoid that type of activity and go somewhere else?
So that's a great question, and I think that the theme of this book is constructive and not sort of deconstructive. The idea wasn't to point out bad practices, and I think maybe the reality of a project like this is that we're trying to move away from the way business as usual in the past. So that means there are probably a lot of examples of the wrong path, right? But by being more constructive, by pointing out successes, I think what we are able to do is identify practices that can be successful that are fairly common and easy to get to. So New Orleans is unique. Right? But Roanoke and their urban forest planning is not unique. Right? We can all look around and stroll down the street and see if there are trees and envision what it would be like if it was different. So, you know, some of the things that we were looking at were very ordinary but very high impact changes that we can make to local governments. And some local governments are making astounding inexpensive changes, as little as changing light bulbs, monitoring their vehicle fleets, thinking about, you know, changing the zoning to make sure density is going the right direction in their community are fairly inexpensive changes that have a really big payoff over the long term.
Well, it's important for all humans to consider what you're considering here, because we all recognize that the resources that we enjoy are finite. So in figuring out how to use those finite resources in a more responsible way in the face of 100 million more Americans within 40 years, and what we will need to be able to accommodate that, which will include our own descendants as well, and how we would want them to look back at us and say, glad they did what they did.
Right.
Glad they started thinking the way they did. And it's very important, and to target local government and empowering local government to recognize that in the aggregate you have tremendous power and to affect the change that should be contemplated as we move forward. As a visionary piece that you co-authored in that way. And we're all, I know that many of our viewers, no doubt, wish, as I do, that we could be students in your class down at Albany Law School to be able to not only hear you speak about this, but the other issues that you're bringing to Albany Law School. Albany Law School is, of course, it's a source of civic pride for all of us here in the Capital Region. And I know that, and for me too, as a graduate, and my grandfather was a graduate as well, back in 1908. So it's a very special place for all of us. And having you as part of that faculty is certainly an example of how we continue to progress positively at Albany Law School.
Thank you very much.
Tell me what you see. How's it going down there? What's the latest? I was down recently for an event, and it seems like things are moving very well. Yeah.
We have an energetic, very excited first-year class. I think there's a lot of energy. Certainly in my property class, they always have lots to say.
Sure.
Of course, our new dean, Dean Andrews, is incredibly innovative. She's visionary. The way she's going about governing the law school, the way she's sort of rethinking the way we communicate and interact, the way we teach, the kinds of demands that we place on ourselves, what the standards should be in the classroom, everything. I'm not sure that anything was wrong before, but she sees it as really an opportunity to be better, and everybody's on board. So it's a very exciting time to be down at Albany Law School.
Well, and even when I was there, it certainly was too. And I just about a week ago, last Saturday, actually, maybe they had a service for my property law teacher, Frank Wallace. Who has recently passed away. And you just don't know at the time, Professor, how you actually touch people's lives as they move forward. And now me practicing over 30 years here in the Albany area, and remembering some of the one-liners that a professor gave me that you carry with you throughout. And of course, one of the ones that he said early on to brand new law students and to the entire class. Was that never practice out of your bailiwick in a criminal case. And he talked about an example where he represented somebody up in a different county, far away from where he usually practiced, and found that without anybody knowing who he was and being able to better understand his issues, he found that he was not as well received in certain areas. So it was a very important lesson. I don't know if that's why I never left Albany County as a result, but nonetheless, and what a special property law teacher he was too.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And you're touching your students now in a way that you won't even recognize now. But 35 years from now, somebody will say, "Well, I know that Professor Hirokawa told me this."
I can't wait to hear about that.
And you never know what it is that you say that they take. But
right.
It's always valuable, and we're very excited about your presence here at Albany Law School and about this book, Greening Local Government, that Professor Keith Hirokawa has co-authored for us, and we've had an opportunity to discuss it today. And Professor, thank you very much for joining me here today and joining the citizens of the town of Colonie.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
We're thrilled. I'm Judge Peter Crummey, and thank you for joining me on Benchmark.